Hey Charm Scouts! Welcome back to my sewing studio. If we haven't met before, I'm Collin, and I am one of the designers of the brand new Camp Gertie pattern, the Scout Dress. I am very excited to walk you through all of the crucial elements in constructing this wonderful mid-century inspired shirtwaist dress. This dress features a really fabulous standout collar, some wonderful bodice and bust shaping, as well as the option for both a gathered in sleeve with this great keyhole detail, or you can bind the arm side to have a sleeveless option, as well as a circular skirt that is lovely and full with about a 200-inch sweep that is knife pleated into the bodice waistline. So you get a very, very wonderful drapey, dramatic effect. And also, please check out the Charm Patterns blog, where I have created a pictorial for you on how to create a matching fabric-covered belt, with a few little steps I've created to make a really wonderful accessory to your brand new dress. In today's tutorial, today's walkthrough, I'm going to do things slightly differently than maybe we're used to in previous projects. I'm going to focus on the new skills in the project and kind of work a little faster through some of the techniques that we've learned in other projects. So please make sure to refer to the written instructions if you have any questions, or if I move past something and you need a little refresher. And of course, we have the Sew and Tell group where you can definitely ask for fitting advice as well as construction advice. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and show you where I've already started and sewn a few things, prepped it off camera. That way you can see exactly where we're diving in, and because we're going to jump ahead 1 or 2 instructions to get started. All right, let's check it out. Okay, so a few things you will definitely want to have on hand is definitely a ruler. I like these clear gridded rulers, or possibly a seam gauge, whichever you prefer. I like to have a point turner ready. You can also use a knitting needle or a straight pen to get out nice sharp corners on our collar. Your favorite fabric shears. I always keep thread snips nearby. You'll want to press with a tailor's ham, as well as a silk organza pressing cloth. I like to have a nice sharp seam ripper ready by, and also we will be sewing with Microtex needles. These are size 70-10. I'm using silk taffeta today, and this is the perfect needle for that. Make sure you're using a Microtex that is the correct weight for your fabric. A couple extra things that we may enjoy for buttonholes, in addition to the seam ripper, is in addition to the seam ripper, for buttonhole making, we may also enjoy using a buttonhole chisel or a buttonhole cutter. I found this guy online. It's from Clover, one of my favorite Notions brands, and these guys are a game changer for nice, crisp buttonholes that don't fray, as well as I have some fray check to make life easy. Okay, so I have here all of my pieces for my scout dress. You can see I have already done some serging along all the edges as per instructed on the instructions. I have also gone a step ahead, and I have sewn and pressed all of my darts on my bodice, as well as done all of my neck edge stay stitching. This is something we do quite often here at Charm and at Camp Gertie, so I felt like that was something we all already have under our belts. Another step that I've kind of done ahead of time, just because I wanted to be able to serge this edge, is I have assembled my facing. So you'll have your back neck facing. I've already got that prepped. I pressed that open, so this seam, press it open. And keep in mind, this is a piece that's been interfaced too. And I've already got that ready so that this is ready to go when I insert the collar and finish the bodice. Speaking of collars, and let's talk about sleeve bands too. I've interfaced one section of the collar, so that's ready to go as well. I've also put all of my markings on all of my skirt pieces, all of my bodice pieces using wax paper and a tracing wheel. And it's really important you use a nice vibrant color that you can see. Hopefully the camera is picking up that I have red dashed lines here to signify all of my knife pleats I will be adding into my skirt pieces. I've notched and serged all of my skirt edges. To begin sewing the scout dress, we are going to first stay stitch the neckline, which I've already done, as well as sew all of our front and back darts, including the bust darts, and then you're going to press everything toward the center back, including on the front. I have got here my bodice back, as well as my bodice front sections, and I'm going to go ahead and lay these right sides together, and using some pins, pin the shoulders and the side seams so that they are ready to take to the sewing machine. You'll note too that the notch on the front shoulder will line up with the dart line. So I like to make sure I pin the dart back the direction I pressed it. I'll go ahead and repeat for the other side. Okay. And I'm going to just find my notch point, and I believe that matches also with my dart. Yep, top of my dart. Now we're on the side of the bodice. Go ahead and pin all of your side and shoulder seams so that it can all be sewn in one sitting. Great little tip there. All right, this guy is ready to take over to the sewing machine. So let's go do that. We're going to begin with by pinning our shoulder seams and side seams of the bodice together. Now keep in mind, I have already stay stitched my necklines as well as sewn and pressed open my darts. Today I'm working with a really wonderful, perfect kind of aqua mid-century silk taffeta. So I will actually be finishing the seams of my bodice using pinking shears, just because I feel like it really gives it the right finish to have that kind of vintage vibe that I'm going for this scout dress. Lining up my shoulders, I'm lining up my notch with my shoulder dart. That shoulder dart really does shape this garment really beautifully. And I've got right sides together. And be sure to use nice glass head pins too if you're using a fabric like a taffeta that don't create too big of a hole when you pin it. Then, moving over to my side seams, I always like to pin from the bottom up for some reason, from the waist side up. Kind of line up my corners, and then you're going to line up that side dart with the notch, and you should be able to kind of pull that into place. I've pressed my dart down, There's a little bit of curvature to accommodate the bust size. I'm sewing the F cup here. And so make sure that you pivot your pinning so that your raw edges meet up appropriately. Again, lining up my notch with my dart, lining up my corners. And I would normally sew this in something that matches, but obviously for camera I'm going to show you a little darker. We're going to use 5/8 seam allowance. Oh, my little foot has gone a little awry for me. And starting with a little bit of backstitching. And I'm going to actually position my needle down. I find that makes it easier to sew. And if you do decide to make this in something like a taffeta, you may need to use both hands to guide the fabric with the feed dog so that it stays nice and taut. And backstitch a little bit. Trim our threads. And of course, moving down to the side seam. Again, 5/8, make sure your corners are nice and lined up. Trim your threads, check your seam to make sure that you don't have any puckers or folds or anything. And we're go ahead and gonna do the other side now. All right, so now that we have our bodice side seams and shoulder seams and darts all sewn, all pressed, I'm gonna go ahead and move on to assembling the collar as well as attaching the facing. Now, something I did off camera was I prepared my facing pieces by interfacing them, as well as sewing those shoulder seams and serging the outer edge. This is one finish I will be serging and not pinking. So that is very, very simple. Definitely refer to the written instructions. It's just 2 seams, pressed flat, ready to go. Next to me, I also have my collar sections, and I have one section that's been interfaced on the wrong side, and this will be the collar that actually shows. So if you look at my shirt that I'm wearing, it'll be the collar that is visible, same kind of thing. Then I have the other side that is not interfaced, and of course I have lower notches on this as well. I'm going to go ahead and line these pieces up. Even though we are not going to be stitching this part, not yet at least, I like to go ahead and pin the notches at the bottom just because I find that that makes it easy to get the rest of it lined up. Lay it nice and flat, get those corners lined up. We're going to sew all the way around the short ends, the longest side, and back down again, but leaving this bottom section open so that we can get in there and understitch and turn this collar out. I always line up my corners first when I'm pressing a collar or stitching a collar. And you may want to have a point turner ready, or a knitted needle or a chopstick. You can also pick out those corners with your straight pins, but I find it's a little easier if you have something with a kind of a dull end to poke it out with. Okay, moving over to the sewing machine, leaving the notched edge open, we're going to stitch 5/8, pivot at the corner, go across the whole long edge, and then come back down and lock off, backstitch to close. Okay, so 5/8 from the edge, starting with a little backstitch. And you may have to move your pins a little bit as you get to that corner. And I always suggest instead of going to the edge, catch yourself at 5/8, so keep your needle down so you can pivot, and you get a nice clean corner that way. Trim your threads. Great, so now I have stitched my whole collar and we'll be ready to grade this and understitch it. So with my favorite shears, I'm going to trim away. I'm going to have the uninterfaced side face me. And I'm going to trim away this facing, or the seam allowance, to about just a scant eighth on one side, on the uninterfaced side, and just a little further out, another little scant eighth, so that we get almost like a little stair, a little step down. And I usually do my grading first, and then I go back and clip all my corners as needed. I find that it makes it easier to grade if you've got one straight go. And kind of have to use two hands. Go ahead and get that. The interface side is just going to be just a little longer, and the reason for that is when you turn this around and after we understitch it, it will lay smoothly and you won't have any kind of bumps or edges. And we want a perfect collar. And I find it's easier to kind of go clockwise with it when you're working on. So start at one end and go around versus trying to do like the edges, the ends first and then the back. Like go in a circle. And after I've fully graded that, I'm going to go ahead and clip these corners. But make sure you don't clip, you leave just a little room so that when you turn this, you don't accidentally poke that seam out. That can happen easier than you think. So make sure you leave at least 1 or 2 stitch lengths from where you finish stitching and your cut edge. And I'm just clipping these corners at a bit of an angle so I have less bulk in the seam allowance. Okay. I'm going to remove these pins, and before I press this, I am going to do a little stay stitching. And I'm going to stay stitch into these corners as best I can, probably be about an inch away from the finished corner, which is fine, as close as you can. And you're going to take the interfacing ledge and you're going to press it toward the uninterfaced side, or the lower collar. And we will stitch the seam allowance to the uninterfaced side about 1/8 of an inch, or a little less than, from the seam. Okay, so over at the machine, I'm going to kind of turn this. It's going to seem a little weird. You kind of have to turn it inside out a little bit to get in that corner. I kind of have to back off of my foot. I just use the little inside toe of my regular A foot. I do 1 or 2 back stitches. And using both hands, you kind of spread the understitching, or you spread the seam allowances, just making sure you can feel that that graded seam allowance is on the side you're stitching, which is the And as you get to the end, you're going to just want to turn it kind of wrong side out, like inside out a little bit. And sew as far to the corner as you can. Don't break your neck trying to get into the very, very, very tiny little nook and cranny. It won't make a difference. Just so that both sides are kind of starting and stopping in the same place is best. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and use a point turner to gently being the key word, gently poke out the corners. Again, make sure you don't accidentally poke through. Less is more. With the pressure, that is. You definitely want to get all of it turned out, but you don't want to poke through any of your stitches. Sometimes you kind of roll it between your fingertips too, and that helps with getting those corners to lie nice and flat, poke out, kind of give the sides a little tug with my finger inside. And now you're going to see that that understitching is going to roll toward the back, so that way you get a nice crisp collar that now you can press really easy by rolling that stitching. And I kind of would do it both directions, with it facing away from me, facing toward me. And after you've got one press, don't be afraid to get in there and give those corners one more little poke, just because now you've kind of warmed up the fabric with the steam, and it will get even crisper. I have to admit, I'm like really in love with this aqua against my pink ironing board. Alright, that looks great. I'm going to go ahead and pin up my notches one more time, and we're going to just, using a long machine stitch, baste across this at a 3/8 seam allowance so that this collar is now sealed up and acts as one. Go ahead and do that. So with a long machine stitch, go ahead and 3/8 basting across the bottom. And you can actually keep it on your machine set to the basting, because the next step is to be basting this to the bodice. Trim my threads. Alright, so now I'm going to go ahead and look at my bodice here, and I'm going to have the right side out facing me. Okay, so I've got the neck edge, we're looking at the correct side of the dress. And I'm going to also lay my finished collar looking at the correct side. So I've got the understitch side, which should be the uninterfaced side, against the correct side of the dress. I'm going to match those notches that are on the collar with the shoulder seams and go ahead and pin those into place. I have one dud pin I keep picking up. I can't stand that. Anyway, go ahead and make sure when you're doing this, if you've pressed your seam allowances at the shoulder a specific direction, like back or open, make sure you're pinning so that it is in the direction that you pressed. And because there's a curve to the neck, you're going to have to just kind of ease it into place. You've got some dots on your bodice front pieces that are going to be your guide for lining up the finished ends of the collar. But just be careful because you're kind of sewing a straight edge to a curved edge here. So it could be easy to get some puckers on the bodice. And we're going to baste this in first, so if you do happen to make any kind of little pucker or mistake, it's a basting stitch. Easy to take out. Not a problem. Okay, almost done. Right, I always just kind of like to check my backside and make sure I haven't pinned any puckers in or anything and that my seam allowances are pinned correctly. Okay, moving over to the sewing machine, still with that long machine stitch and a 3/8 seam allowance. I'm going to baste this into place. If you're finding that you pinned and your notches are all lined up, but you've got some spots where it's like wanting to ruffle, almost like you needed to ease it, manipulate your bodice a little bit, because that could just be some of the bulk, that curved edge, you know? Just kind of playing games with you. Okay. So now that that's basted, I am going to check that I didn't create any kind of puckers, that I like my seam line, make sure that everything is symmetrical before moving on and closing this up. Because once you've done the facing on this and trimmed it and graded it and understitched it, it's not going anywhere. But yeah, that looks great. I'm really happy with that. My basting, that's a good thing about basting it in. If I didn't like something, it'd be easy to remove. But looks good. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and move over to back to the pressing board, my layout, and I'm gonna put my finished, or my assembled facing that we did off camera on top of this. All right, I am going to take my now basted in collar and bodice and my assembled facing unit, we'll call it a facing unit, and lay these right sides together, and this we're going to go ahead and stitch in place. I'm going to line up my corners first, just because I find that that makes life a little easier. And it's going to feel like it's not going to fit at first. Just mess with it a little bit, because these, again, it's a curve. And you're going to line up this seam with the notch and ultimately the shoulder seam as well. Go ahead and give that a little pin. And kind of pull on your curve, pin in the middle, like center back to center back. and you're sandwiching in that collar. And make sure as you're pinning this, make sure you're turning your curve, like following the curve. And that should pin in pretty easy. It fits really beautifully. The interfacing definitely gives this some nice body as well. Then we're going to line up our corner down at the bottom at the waist. Okay. Line up other side as well. Great. And I'm going to start from the bottom edge, stitch all the way along the front facing side, pivoting at the corner, stitch all the way across the neckline, pivoting at this corner, and come down and finish with some back stitching here. Then we will grade that, clip into it as necessary, do a little understitching, and it'll be ready to go. So with that being said, let me hop over to the sewing machine and stitch that in place with you. Let's do it together. Okay, so now that I've got that pinned, I'm going to go ahead and, starting at the bottom corner with the right side of the dress facing me, but I'm looking at the wrong side of the facing, and I've got the bulk of the bodice to the left of the needle. I'm going to go ahead and stitch the facing in place, making sure I keep everything nice and lined up. And you're going to sew this with your traditional 5/8 seam allowance. And do note that there's a little kind of pivot point along the facing where the lapel kind of juts out a little bit. And right as I get to 5/8, I'm going to put my needle down. Ooh, I actually went... I overshot by like one stitch, so I'm going to backstitch. It'll be fine. There we go. Okay, take my pin out. And after I pivot, I make sure to kind of rearrange my project so that it's, you know, laying smooth. Especially this curved neck edge, it can be really easy to get it kind of wavy and create unnecessary puckering that you have to pick out. We are in a pucker-free zone, okay? The only puckering I want is lemonade. Thank you. Okay. And just following that curve. Take your time. This goes together quickly, but it's this is the part you don't want to rush on. Because the collar, I don't know, I think that's one of the biggest selling points of this garment. Making sure now I'm sewing between a lot of thicknesses. I've got the collar, I've got the lapel, or the facing, and I've got the bodice of the dress. So take your time. Make sure you have a nice sharp needle too. Pull out your pins as you go. Adjust so that the bulk is, you want the bulk of your bodice laying as flat as you can. This is actually the longest seam in the whole bodice, so take your time on it. It's worth getting it right and not having to go back and redo it. But if you do make a mistake, you know, if you're not sure, if you're not as confident on sewing that curve, feel free to baste it in with a machine stitch first. Check your lines and then just stitch right on top of your basting. But I like a challenge and I have no fear. Fearless. Charm Scouts are fearless. Okay, I'm at my 5/8 mark. I'm gonna go ahead and pivot and just sew straight down. Keeping in mind that little bit of pivoting I'll do, just that very slight. It's like when GPS tells you to make a slight left turn, but really the street's just veering, you know? That's what we're doing when we sew this part of the lapel. Now that I'm approaching the end, I'm going to go ahead and backstitch, trim my thread, and we should be in business. So now that I've stitched along the whole facing all the way around, and I've checked my work and make sure that I liked everything before I start cutting into my seam allowances, we're going to go ahead and grade the seam allowance, but we're going to do it actually the opposite, because we're going to grade the outer dress, which is uninterfaced, to be longer, and the interfaced section to be shorter. So we'll go ahead and do that over here on my pressing board. We're also going to make a couple little snips and clips into the neckline because it is so curved. You want to clip into it so that it opens out. Okay, so now we're going to clip into, grade and clip into our facing, and to do that, I'm gonna have the interface side up because we're gonna trim that section actually shorter. And just make sure your pieces are kind of laying flat. As you turn each corner, just kind of manipulate it so that, you know, you're working with as straight of a line as you can. Careful, sometimes the seam allowance that kind of will want to, you'll want to accidentally cut both. Sometimes it's easier if you kind of turn it away from you. Sorry if my hand is blocking. But yeah, you're just trimming your interfacing, or your seam allowance of the interface section down to a scant eighth, and following just along that on the outs, just a little longer, a little wider on the dress front, which is the uninterfaced section. Because we will be doing some understitching. That's why we want to do this, so that it lays nice and smooth, just like we did on the collar. If you've been hanging around Camp Gertie for a while, you know about understitching. I don't know why I want to keep saying interfacing. I don't know why. Okay. And following my advice of kind of going clockwise or in a circle, like one end to the next end, just the way you stitch it, we're going to trim it that way too. And when you get to the collar, you're going to want to trim that back too, but we're going to trim that along with the dress front rather than the facing. So it might get in your way a little bit. And careful, don't snip your fingertips or nothing. All right. Now cutting the collar and the dress front as one. I like to kind of use my stay stitching as my guide. Like I just cut right outside that stay stitching because I actually kind of like to keep it in if I can and not trim it away. I'm talking about the stay stitching I did at the beginning. Okay. And we're going to grade this last long seam. If you've made a press sleeve shirt like the one I'm wearing, you'll know it's a very similar step that you do with the facing. And you get nice little threads everywhere. It's wonderful. No one ever said sewing was a neat and tidy hobby. I will say cutting this silk taffeta, it has like the most satisfying like cut sound. It's the silly things in life, right? Okay, so you can see that this piece, this facing is like all ruffly. That's because I've got a curve pulled flat. Because the curve is gonna open outwards when we turn it the correct way, we're gonna just make some clips. We're not gonna cut notches, we're gonna make just some snips. I like to kind of do this little, and make sure you don't snip through your stitching, but I like to, so you need nice sharp scissors, but I like to just do little kind of 1/2 inch snips along the whole neck band and into the lapel a little bit too. And then we're going to cut the corners as well. And it's really important you get this little section right where it really curves out after the shoulder seam. Okay, and just like we did on the collars, we're going to trim the corners first at a 45-degree angle, then just thin them down, but make sure you don't trim it too much because you could accidentally poke it through when you're turning it. Okay, so leave a stitch length or 2 millimeter of space and just trim away the bulk. Okay. And make sure you toss those little corner pieces because they will haunt you for the rest of your life. You'll be wearing them the whole time you're sewing this. Okay, so I know right now I've got this on the pressing board and it's very tempting to just go in and start pressing, but we're going to do a little bit more understitching. I swear, I think this is the last of the understitching. Almost. I don't know. Now, if you placed all your markings on, you should have a dot. For me, it's an X because I use a tracing wheel. On your facing, I put it on the right side of the facing, not the inner face side, because that's your stopping point for understitching the facing. Then we're going to also understitch between the shoulder seams of the back neck edge, and then again on the front. Okay, so we'll go ahead, and that's before we do any pressing. I haven't even poked out my corners or anything yet. We're gonna leave the We're going to leave the notches of the lapel understitched because as long as we do it below and at the neck, it should be okay. We're going to understitch by pushing the graded seam allowance, this time toward the facing. I'm going to start just like we said before, with the bottom edge going up toward the collar. Then I'm going to do the neck edge. Then I'll finish at the bottom. And I'm going to stop at that small dot, or for me it's a little X because I used a tracing wheel. And just 1 or 2 little back stitches just to anchor. And make sure you can feel the seam allowances. They're graded, so they're kind of hard to feel. You want those pressing toward the facing. And the reason we're stopping at that little dot is that that is our turnout point. So if you were to continue past that, you're going to see it when you wear the garment. And we don't want that understitching to show. It's just more to keep this for where the button placket nice and smooth. And it will also be like a pressing tool. And 1 or 2 little back stitches just to secure that in place. Okay, moving right along. Now this you're gonna have to finagle just a little bit. You want the curved edge of your back neck facing to be to the right of the needle. And you're gonna take all of that trimmed and clipped into seam allowance, and you're gonna understitch that to the facing, starting at the shoulder seam. So we're gonna stitch from shoulder seam to shoulder seam along the back neck. Make sure you do a little understitch, and you're gonna have to kind of swing the bulk of that curved edge away. And when you're understitching, you just want to be a little less than 1/8 away from the ditch of the seam line. And the nice thing is, if this is done in a thread that matches, you will not even see it at all. Okay. All right, now I've done my row of understitching. Trimming my threads. And we're going to poke out these corners of the lapels, and you're going to see this is going to press now really nicely because we've done that understitching. So let me go ahead and take my point turner, and I'm going to just gently kind of poke through. Again, don't press too hard. I'm just kind of nudging it, you know, just giving it a little encouragement, because you could easily, this point turner is not sharp, but it does have a point. That's the point. And you could easily, and I've done it more than once, poke all the way through that corner, and then you'll just be miserable. You'll just be so mad. And Charm Scouts are not miserable people. We are very happy, positive people. So nothing that will cause us misery or anguish. Okay, and you can see I'm gonna now press this open, and it's actually gonna press really beautifully because we did that clipping, because we've understitched, and then we will do some hand tacks to lock this we'll do some hand tacking to lock the facing down at the shoulder seams. If you've underlined your bodice, like done a second layer under your fashion fabric, you can actually whip stitch this all the way down around, and that'll give you a really supportive collar. I've understitched the back neck. I'm going to do that last little section in the front, starting at my dot and going toward the waistline. I'm going to start with a little back stitch. Turn my back stitch off. And work my way down. You'll want to do this before you press. It'll help your facings press really nice and crisply, so they crispy. And backstitch just a little bit. Okay, trim your threads and go ahead and take this over to the pressing board after you poke out those corners too. Okay, so now that I have poked out the corners, I've understitched both front sections under the dot, or below the dot, and I've understitched between the shoulder seams and on the back neck edge. I'm going to go ahead and press this. Depending on your fabric, you may want to use a pressing cloth. My taffeta actually doesn't really, it's okay. And my iron, I'm really just going to glide it over the top. If I decide to press this from the front, I will use a pressing cloth. But just know your fabric, do some testing before. And I like to just kind of roll that corner. You can see you get a nice, pretty lapel. I'm going to do the front line of the dress first, like down the center front, which will eventually become your button placket. And then I will do the collar because I want to use a ham or a curved surface seam roll, whatever you have on hand. And just really get in there and on the the underlined section, just get in there and really roll those seams out. Okay, I'm gonna grab my tailor's ham and lay my neck back edge. I'm gonna start in the middle and work my way out to the edge. And the reason I'm doing this on a curve is because it's a curved seam. Kind of just pull that away, like so it's nice and smooth. All right, so now that we've completed the bodice side seams, shoulder seams, all the darts, we've put the facing in and the collar in, and we've understitched and pressed that, we're gonna go ahead and move on to the sleeves. If you can see behind me, I have the bodice on the dress form, and I've already sewn one sleeve in, and I just wanted to make sure that I could show you the best possible way, but it will end up being a little bit of a cap sleeve with a little bit of gathering pleated into the keyhole and armband. So in front of you, you should have your sleeve. And I've already pre-marked that and also cut out my keyhole with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I have my Keyhole bias binding. You'll have cut out 2 of these. Make sure it was cut on the bias, so at a 45-degree angle across the grain. And then you'll also have your interfaced and notched sleeve band piece. And keep in mind, this will have a little bit of an extension when you sew it. To get started, we're going to go ahead and do the keyhole binding. For this bit, I am going to use matching thread. So hopefully you can see the thread enough on camera, just because I am going to do a little bit of top stitching and I want to just make sure that it matches. But for all the construction elements of this dress, or of the sleeve, I will sew in a dark thread like I have been through the video. So let's go ahead and turn over to our working camera, and I will show you how to properly pin the keyhole binding so that we can go ahead and get that sewn before we move on to pleating and prepping the rest of the sleeve. Okay, so I've got the right side of my sleeve with my keyhole cut out. I actually cut mine on a fold, so I have a crease that's notating the center of the keyhole, but you can definitely either put a notch or stick a pin. Then I'm going to take my bias binding, and I'm also going to find the center of that. Just notate it. Again, you can do a little snip or a pin. And you're going to line that up. And I find it easiest to not pin more than maybe 2 places. Just pin at your starting point, which is going to be, you know, a fourth of an inch into this bottom section here, into the seam allowance along the bottom of the sleeve. And actually, just kind of line, if you kind of pull the keyhole straight to match that straight edge, and then kind of stretch the bias binding along the edge, you'll find that you get a pretty easy, it matches up pretty easy. All right. So we're going to take that over to the sewing machine and stitch it with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So, like I said, I'm just going to go ahead and sew this with a matching thread and a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And be sure to back stitch to get started. And I'm going to do this with my needle down. That way if I have to rotate anything, it makes it a little easier. And for me, this inside of my, the inside of the toe of the presser foot is a 1/4 inch. And I'm just going to make sure that the fullness of the sleeve is swung out of the way as I sew around this curve. And in case I didn't mention this when I pinned it, this is right sides together. So if your fabric, my fabric kind of doesn't have a right or wrong side, but if you're using something with maybe a print, then it will matter. And as you get around the curve, it will get a little easier, but just make sure you're kind of pulling everything taut so that you don't have any wrinkles or bumps under. And I'm going to go ahead and actually remove my last couple pins so that I can just keep the 2 pieces lined up as I sew. I find that that makes it a little easier. If you're not as confident with sewing around a curve like this, you can start in the center at the top of the keyhole and work your way down instead of going from one end to the other. Alright, we're going to trim our threads, and as long as your seam allowance, or your binding ends in the 5/8 seam allowance here, even if it's a little uneven, like one side's a little higher, it's not going to matter because it's going to get closed up anyway. So don't stress too much. All right, and now you can see I've got a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around. I'm happy, I don't have any wrinkles or anything. And we're going to start folding this in toward itself and seal it up. And I'm going to go ahead and pin that as I go. And I like to kind of do the outer portion first, like the more on a straight section first. And I can use my stitching line as a guide as to where to fold this over. And you can do, now to close this up, you have a couple options. You can either, the simplest is to slip stitch this in place by hand, or you can do what I'm going to do, and I'm actually going to top stitch this because I've kind of decided I like the look of top stitching on this fabric. So that's why I switched to a matching thread. I keep picking up the same, the same bent pin. Throw your bent pins away. Okay, and then as you see, if you lay this flat and kind of adjust your binding, you kind of hold the sleeve. Okay. And check it on the other side as well. I'm going to move this over to the pressing board. Sometimes you want to kind of pull the sleeve so that it's as flat as it'll go. It will be kind of 3D right here, and especially as you have pins in it. And I like to just hit it with a little steam. Just kind of warm up that fabric. And then you can kind of adjust as you need. Like I'm finding mine's just a little too thin right in the center. And it'll lay a little smoother if I kind of thicken it out a little bit, roll a little bit. Just play with it until you're happy with it. And then from the wrong side, you can slip stitch this by hand, sealing up the bias, or you can do what I'm going to do, and I'm actually going to take this over to the sewing machine and top stitch it because I did a little experimenting and I actually really like how the top stitching looks on this particular fabric. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then we'll continue with getting the rest of the sleeve put together. Back over to the sewing machine, seal this up. I'm going to sew right at that edge through all thicknesses. And pulling out some pins as I go, kind of swinging the sleeve as I need. Take your time around the curve. I did some testing of this fabric and matching thread to it, and I just really like the look of it with the top stitching. I think it gives it a little bit more of a handmade look that doesn't look homespun. Okay, very pretty. Okay, so looking at the correct side, or the right side of the sleeve with our keyhole sewn, we're going to go ahead and make the pleats at the lower edge of the sleeve. So starting at the line closest to the keyhole, we're going to go ahead, and that's going to be our first line. We're going to go to the line just to the side of that, and we're going to take that line and bring it to the first line. Mind you, this is on the outside, or the right side of the sleeve, so you may need to transfer your markings. And I'm going to go ahead and pin that. I'm going to go ahead and skip one line and bring the next line to the line that we skipped. creating little folds that point toward the keyhole on the outside of the sleeve. Pin that in place. And I like to always pin actually at the seam line, the 5/8 seam line, so a little bit further down, not right on the edge. And take that final line and bring it to the remaining line. So you're going to skip a line to the very last line and bring the outer line to the line that you skipped. Lining up your edges and your pleat marks. And go ahead and pin that. And that should create 3 little even pleats on one side of the keyhole. I'm going to go ahead and spin that around and repeat. So looking at the first line, go to the line just to the side of that and bring that over and place a pin at the seam line. Skip that line and take the next line to the line you just skipped to create your next pleat and pop a pin in that. And we're going to go to the very last line and bring it to the line we just skipped and create our third pleat. And pop a pin in that. Take a moment to look at your pleats, make sure that they are symmetrical since these will be right next to each other. I like to hit this with just a bit of steam, not actually pressing it down, just to put a little muscle memory into the fabric. And then we're going to take this over to the machine, and with a long machine stitch, we're going to baste across at 3/8 within the 5/8 seam allowance, just to secure those to make it easier to sew. All right, let's go over to the machine and do that, and then we'll move on. We are going to use a long basting stitch, a machine based. So I have like my stitch length that is at 6. And using a 3/8 seam allowance, I'm going to go ahead and just baste across those. Just to kind of lock that in place. Oops. And trim your threads, just not so close that they come undone, because that would be, having to redo that would be so annoying, or when you're trying to put the binding on, oh my goodness. Okay, both sides of the pleats. This is when using that little bit of steam really helps because it holds your pleats kind of smoothly and flat. And don't take your machine off of basting quite yet, or machine to that long stitch, that 6-inch stitch length, 5 or 6, whatever your machine is. Mine has an automated base that works really great for gathering, because I'm going to flip to the correct side, the right side, where I've put my dots. These are, for me, are X's because I used a tracing wheel, but we're going to do some long gathering stitches between dots. The first being a 3/8 seam allowance, and the second row being within that 3/8 and the raw edge, so about a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And don't trim away too close because you want a little bit of that bobbin thread so that we can gather in this sleeve to the arm side. All right, go right along. Just a nice even distance, about a 1/4 inch. Just kind of split the difference of the 3/8 seam allowance. All right. And we're going to not pull up on those quite yet. We are going to switch back to a regular stitch length. So I'm back at, for me, that's a 2.5. And we're going to sew the underarm seam. And the underarm seam is a 5/8 seam allowance, traditional. And then we will finish that however you like. I'm going to use pinking shears on mine. And you will then press that seam open. And then we're ready to set this in. the sleeve, and when I say set this in, we need to put the sleeve band on first. So set it into the sleeve band and then the arm side. So the sleeve comes together pretty easily once you get past all those pleats and that tricky keyhole. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and for me, pink my seam allowance. I'll use a tailor's ham or a sleeve roll. I just happen to have my tailor's ham handy. Put that inside. And if I can get these to separate, sometimes that pinky makes it kind of stick to itself. There we go. And I'm going to just kind of start by pulling that by hand, but I will press that open with some steam. And now you can see your, turn it to the right side, and you can see your pleated keyhole. So cute. And this will be then gathered in, but we got to put the sleeve band on first. All right, so once you've finished your pleats, your underarm seam, and your keyhole, go ahead and grab your notched and interfaced sleeve band section, and we will go ahead and sew that on now. So now that we have sewn the underarm seam, sewn the pleats, sewn the keyhole, as well as put our gathering stitches at the cap of the sleeve, it is now time to sew on the sleeve band. So to get started here, you're going to want to have the right side of your sleeve facing you. They turn so the sleeve is right side out. Then we are going to take that center notch that we've clipped, and with right sides together, and that's on the sleeve band, you're going to line that up with the underarm. And go ahead and pop a pin in that. Then you're just going to continue to wrap around until you reach the end of the sleeve. And notice you're going to have a 1 and 5/8 inch extension on both sides of the keyhole. And that is so that we can sew a little overlap. So just continue to pin all the way around, lining up notches and such. Alright. Just check that your lengths are the same. We're good. Actually, I'm going to readjust this one just a hair because I think I pulled it too taut. Great. Okay. Now that you have that all the way pinned, we're going to go over to the machine and we're going to sew 5/8. Okay. And just make sure that you caught the ends of your bias binding on both sides, just to make sure that that all gets tucked in evenly. Okay, trim your threads so that they're not in your way. Then we're actually going to take these ends and fold them right sides together and pin on both sides. And I like to do this before I've done any seam grading, just because I find that it makes it a little bit easier to sew. You're going to want to put a pin right where you can feel the end of your binding. And actually, you're going to want to make sure you're pinning on the side where your stitching shows, because that'll be easier to see. Pin on the side where your initial stitching is. Line up those corners and pin again. Okay? Take that over to your machine and you're going to sew at 5/8. Make sure you backstitch at that corner on the fold. And you're going to sew until you're in line with your first row of stitching. Pivot and sew until you meet that stitching all the way at where you can feel the bulk of the bias binding of the keyhole until you feel the sleeve again. And trim your threads nice and close. We're then going to do some trimming here. We're going to trim at a 45-degree angle, trim that corner. Come in and trim again at an angle, trimming the corner. Trim nice and close, maybe an 1/8 inch away. Let's get that little thread while you're at it. Do that on both sides, of course. Remember to not trim through your threads. Okay. All right. We're also going to do a little bit of seam grading. We are going to trim, you're going to want to I like to do this with the inside facing me. We're going to trim the sleeve, not the sleeve band, so the uninterfaced section, down to, and also this pleating section, down to a scant 1/8. Figure out the best way to hold it. For me, is to kind of fold back and trim across. And once you trim that, you're going to then trim the interface section just to be just slightly longer than that. Okay, and once that's trimmed, you can go ahead and turn your extensions out and turn in the seam, the raw edge into the inside of the sleeve, or the wrong side of the sleeve. I like to use a point turner to go ahead and get that fully turned out. Again, careful, don't poke out your corners. That can be easy to do. And once you have your extensions poked out, turn the sleeve to the wrong side, and you're going to fold the raw seam allowance over your stitching line, and then put a pin. And it should fold and create a 1-inch band across the whole sleeve. Kind of helps if you kind of work from the outsides in. Make sure you're getting those corners tucked in. So turning under 5/8, pinning as I go. And you can get a ruler out and check that it's 1 inch all you want, or you can do what I'm doing and just get it by using that stitching line as your guide. Okay. And once you have it all the way pinned around, I'm going to use a little steam. On my tailor's hand. And just don't go over the pins, but just crease your outer band and your corners. And you can now either top stitch this like I'm going to, because I've decided I like the look of that, or you can slip stitch this by hand if you want it to be completely invisible. So let's go over to the machine so I can close this up. Top stitch this sleeve band. You can definitely slip stitch this invisibly, but I've decided as a style design I kind of like how this top stitching looks. And I'm stitching through all thicknesses. I'm just making sure I can feel the other side of the sleeve band, the wrong side, being closed up by this section of top stitching. Alright, so now that we have the sleeve completely constructed, it's time to go ahead and sew it into the bodice of the dress. So I have the sleeve with the right side out, and I have the dress, and I'm going to place that over the top of the sleeve. So now I have right sides together, and I'm looking at the wrong side of the dress. And I'm going to go ahead and stick a pin matching the underarm seams. Alright. I also have a a mark at the top, a notch at the top that I'm going to line up with the center, or the shoulder seam. So it's the top notch of the sleeve and the shoulder seam. Then I'm going to, before I get to any of my gathering, I'm going to go ahead and line up all of my other notches along the arm side and pin until I get to just within an inch of where that gathering stitching starts. And I'm pinning so that I can see the pins on the shirt. Or sorry, the bodice of the dress, shirtwaist dress. Okay, I'm gonna put this under this camera so you can see. Now, I've got some loose baggage here. I am going to pull up on my bobbin threads and gather in all of this sleeve cap until I am at an even gathering. And since I've got this shoulder seam pinned, that's working as an anchor. Okay. And you have some dots on your arm side that should line up with the dots on your sleeve. Go ahead and pin that in place. Repeat on the other side, pulling up on your bobbin threads, which should be on the inside if you ran your basting on the right hand side, or the right side of the fabric. Okay. Line up your edges, even out your gathering a little bit, adjust it until you're happy with it. And I'm going to just unpin just a little bit. I want a little bit more gathering to the right. Okay. And just smooth out your gathers until you're really happy with them. I need a little bit of more, a little less in one spot, a little more here. Don't pull too hard or you'll get a lot of frayed edges. Okay. Really make sure that's nice and pinned securely. Need to pull that in just a little bit tauter and pin that around. Once you've got that all the way pinned in place, just make sure all your gathers are nice and secure. You're going to take this over to the free arm of the machine and stitch it around 5/8 all the way around. Now, as you go around, you're going to want to straighten out the bulk of the bodice of this dress, and also make sure you're using both hands so that you keep both pieces really smooth and you don't accidentally get any puckers or unnecessary, unwanted gathers. just do a couple of back stitches just to secure everything. And you can trim away your threads. This is now a chance for you to turn to the right side. Check that you don't have any gathers where you don't want them. And check that you're happy with your gathers. And if you are, which it looks like I think I am, and my underarm seam is lined up, you will do a second row of stitches or serge that inside and then either trim away if you've done the second row of stitches, or the serger will trim for you. So I'll go ahead and do that off camera, and that's just to secure. But now your bodice, other than buttons, which we'll do at the very end, your bodice is ready and we can move on to the skirt. Now we're gonna create the pleats. I've got wrong sides up, and I'm not sure if the camera's gonna pick this up, but I do have dashed lines here for my tracing wheel. And I have the two fronts of the skirt, and I know that the front because I pressed the pockets toward the front. I have those facing each other. And the way you're going to create these pleats so that they give you that mirrored effect, where the front is mirrored coming off center front and the back is mirrored, is you're going to start with the second line from the center front, or from toward the front, and you're going to take that second line and bring it to the first line, creating a fold. And mind you, I'm working on the wrong side. So, and then I'm going to pin that. Okay, and pin it nice and, pin it actually a little bit deep, kind of on the 5/8 mark. All right? And then just kind of pull that straight as you go. Then I'm going to skip a line and go to the second line and bring it to the line I skipped. And you'll notice that the bulk of the pleats are going to stack up next to each other. So your pleats should not be overlapping. And again, pin that at the 5/8 mark. Skip a line, bring that second line to the line you skipped, like keeping the top of the skirt and the stay stitching aligned. Pin that. Okay, skip a line. Now I'm on the last line. And sometimes you kind of have to just lay it a little flat and adjust it. But now I'm at the last line, closest to the seam allowance, or the seam, and I'm gonna bring that over to the line I skipped. And pin. Okay, pin it nice and taut. Now, I'm gonna go and do the exact same thing, but in the opposite direction. So now that you have the scout dress fully sewn, you've got all your facings put in, you've sewn your skirt to your bodice, your sleeves are in, it's time to put our closures in. And just like this month's merit badge, that's going to be buttons and buttonholes. So let me walk you through what I've already done so that we're prepared. On my skirt front, I have transferred my markings from the pattern for my buttonhole placement. On my machine, I'm set up with my automatic buttonhole foot, and I have the buttonhole on my machine set to the correct size for my buttonhole for the button I'm going to be using. I'm just using some small 1/2" mother of pearl buttons. So every machine is going to be slightly different. Every foot might look a little different. Mine has a little wheel. Yours might be a little sliding square, a little rectangle that slides. But buttonholes by machine are all kind of sewn the same way. Typically, they sew a stay stitch backwards, zigzagging over it like a satin stitch or a really tight zigzag, goes across, and then repeats on the other side and seals it up. So I will show you on mine. Yours might look just a little different. Again, every machine's a little different. Mine does all the steps where I don't have, it's all automated because I have a computerized machine. If you have a non-computerized machine, you may have to crank your wheel one turn every single time the step is complete. So just check your machine, see what works best for you, what foot you have. Also, I highly recommend, before you get into your garment, actually doing a test buttonhole on some scraps. Make sure you put a piece of interfacing in there too, the same that you've used. So you'll want 2 layers of your fashion fabric or your dress fabric with a piece of interfacing sandwiched in between to do your test buttonholes. And do a couple if you're kind of not used to them. Depending on what fabric you've used, these should be pretty simple to sew. Most of these kind of lightweight shirtings will sew pretty easy. So I'm going to go ahead and, with the right side of the dress as worn, I'm going to go ahead and get my first buttonhole lined up. And I'm going to actually work my way up from the bottom. And although I've already done a test buttonhole, you never know. You just want to do an inconspicuous spot. So for me, I have this purple dot here. I know that's the exact dot from the pattern, but that's going to be my starting point because my buttonhole sews backwards first. So I know that this is going to end up being the top. And this mark is 5/8 from the edge. I'm going to line that up also, my folded edge, with 5/8. Okay? And I like to start with my needle down. And it should land, for me, it's going to land right next door to that dot because the dot is on center front, the 5/8 mark, and we want this to be we want center front to be centered in the buttonhole. Okay? And I have this little wheel that I have to make sure is in the right position. And all we have to do is you're going to keep your seam allowance, or your folded edge. We folded back the facing. And you're going to keep that lined up. And go slow here. So that's step number 1. Then I'm moving on to step 2. And that is a completed buttonhole. So you're going to snip away all of your threads. And I did switch to a matching thread so that you can see. Okay? So once you've got the first one, don't cut it open yet. I have some tips for that as well. We're going to go ahead, starting with, I'm using my hand wheel to make sure my needle is right next to that dot, right in the right placement. Stitch right through it. Okay. I'm going to break this down for you one more time too, in case your machine is a hand crank. I unfortunately only have computerized machines, so I can't show you a hand crank machine myself. Not unfortunately only have computerized machines, but I only have computerized machines. But I will slow down and I will tell you when you would have to crank each step. Okay, lining up with 5/8. Okay. So this would be step 1, and so you've got your first leg of your button. This is when you would crank, switch to step number 2, which is going to be moving over and doing. So right there where it's doing the cap, that's on most machines is either step 2 or 3. And then this would be step 2 or 3. Every machine's a little different. And that's sewing the second leg. And step 4, where you would crank that 4th time, is closing it off. And I'm starting to sew a second buttonhole. Okay. All right, so that's 3 of the buttonholes. There is, let me double check. There's 9 total down the front of the dress, and including on the bodice. So go ahead and sew all of those, and before you cut them open, come back and we will do that together. All right? Okay, so now I've got all of my sewn buttonholes here. And there's a couple ways that you can go ahead and open these up so that you can actually, put a buttonhole through. Probably the most common is to use a seam ripper. You'll want to make sure that you have a nice sharp seam ripper. And another little trick is pop a pin into the top of your buttonhole. So that way, when you slide open, you have a stop and you won't accidentally slice that open and have to redo your buttonhole. So that's method number 1. Probably the most common. Another favorite is actually, I like a lot, is the buttonhole chisel. Now you do have to do this on a healing mat or a cutting mat. But basically, you line up the chisel right in the center of your buttonhole, and you are going to rock it back and forth, applying a little pressure until it's cut open. And the reason I prefer that is you tend to get less threads and such. And I have a rubber mallet as well, because sometimes if you're using a really heavy-duty fabric, like something that's a little thicker, you can also just lightly tap, and that usually also will cut your buttonhole. So either rock or tap. You can hear the cutting. Careful though, these are very sharp, so definitely hold on to the case that it comes in. And you don't have to tap very hard either. And that gives you a nice sharp edge, but especially in areas where you maybe are going through multiple layers. But I really like the buttonhole chisel. This one's from Clover, as is my seam ripper, and it's really sharp. But there's nothing wrong with using the seam ripper as well. Okay, so after you have opened up your buttonholes, it is a good idea to apply just the tiniest little bit of, as I ooze a bunch out, fray check, okay? This one's completely clear, but make sure you check your fabric, test it first. I already did, I know it dries fine. And you're just gonna barely pop a little bit on your buttonhole. Another way to do that as well is just a little scrap of your fabric and just sponge it on. You can also do this with a little piece of cotton muslin as well. And that really just helps to seal up and you don't get any holes. I kind of spread open the buttonhole. Or you can do some with a seam ripper, whatever you prefer. Actually, I think I will go ahead and stick that one. And last one here, I'll go ahead and do this one with a seam ripper just to show. Pop a pin so that you don't slice through. Okay. And that is the proper way to open up your buttonhole. All right, so now that we've sewn our buttonholes, it's time to sew on our buttons. Of course, you can sew this by hand, but some of us also can do machine buttonholes. So I'm going to show you both ways. I'm going to show you hand sewing on the sleeve and on down the front of the shirt, or the shirtwaist dress. I'm going to do these by machine. So looking over here at my machine, you can see I have a specialized button holder foot. A lot of newer machines do have these, which is really convenient. I have this little pair of tweezers that hold the button in place. So I have my marking here, this purple dot. I'm going to line that up so that when I place the button, that is basically centered underneath, because that mark is directly from the pattern. And I'm just going to put my foot down and take out the tweezers. Oops. And this is actually a button holder foot. So I'm going to start with my needle, and I have the machine set to a zigzag with the feed dogs down. So I like to do 2 passes. You'll want to test the width by hand cranking your needle. So that way you don't have any broken needles. So I'll go ahead and do that again. And I am lining up my markings with the folded edge with the 5/8 line on my sewing machine. Okay, and just good practice, manually put down your needle and okay, so I will show you again. You're going to set your machine that you have the feed dogs down into a zigzag stitch. And the width of that zigzag is going to depend on the width of your buttonholes, like the actual holes in the button. And if you do not have a buttonhole foot, you're going to use your regular foot, but you may need to use some long tweezers, something like what you would thread a serger with, like something like these here, for actually holding the button in place. You can also, depending on your comfort level with machine sewn buttons, of course you can sew these by hand as well. So I'm going to go ahead and just put all 9 buttons down the center front using my markings from the pattern as a guide. And then I will move on to the sleeve and I will show you how I'm going to sew those buttons on because they're going to be just slightly different. It's really important you remember to have your feed dogs down. Otherwise your button will shift all over the place and you'll be not a happy camper. And we only want happy campers at Camp Gertie. Alright, and I'm just trimming each thread as I go. So go ahead and sew all of the buttons, either by hand or by machine, and then we will move on to sewing on the sleeve buttons and closing those up. Okay, so now that I have my dress pretty much completed, the only last step is to sew on the buttons onto the sleeve band. I have decided to use these larger buttons that are actually shank buttons because I just thought they were a bit more decorative. So I'm going to go ahead and put those in place. I've already sewn one, and actually I'm not even sewing a buttonhole. I am just going to sew the button through all the layers so that way the armhole is big enough that you don't actually have to unbutton it. So I've done one side, I'm going to go ahead and do the other. So I have a pretty small, I'm not quite sure what size needle this is because I've had it forever, pretty small hand sewing needle with about, I would say, 2 feet of thread looped through so it's doubled and tied in a knot at the end, okay? And I have my overlap pinned in place so that's about 1 inch apart. And I am going to find the dead center of that, right where I want that button to sit. I'm going to poke that through, okay? And don't worry too much if you have long threads on your knot. You can always trim them a little closer and the button's gonna cover them. And you can do it from the back side too, but I like to be able to find it right in the front. And I like to do a couple little passes through the front and back just to make sure that that is really secure, because that's going to secure these 2 overlaps first. Then, when I've got the thread facing the front, I'm going to go ahead and make a pass through the loop or the shank and poke it right on back through, and that will secure my button. I chose a button that, since I'm not actually making a buttonhole that this will sink into, I chose a button that is relatively got a short shank to it. And then I'm going to poke through again from the back side, pass through the loop of the button, the shank, and poke to the wrong side. And I'm going to do about 5 or 6 passes through the loop. I do have doubled up thread through the button loop, and back through. Okay, just till you feel like that button is really secure. Okay. And that's 5 passes. I'll go ahead and do 6. And then we're going to tie it in a knot in the back. Pulling it through. It's going to be my last pass through the loop. Back to the back side. Oops. And if you accidentally catch yourself, I always seem to do that. Just pull your needle through. Okay. On the back side, I'm going to just grab a little thread through and tie my little knot. nice and tight. And if you didn't catch that, so you're gonna poke through some fabric, just take a bite of fabric. Okay, now you've got a loop, and you're gonna run your needle through that loop, put your thumb over it, slide it shut, and trim your thread nice and close, because now you've got a knotted button. And that guy is doing, not only is it decorative, but it also is holding the armband shut. All right, and now you're ready to wear your scout dress. All you need to do is narrow hem at the bottom. All right, Charm Scouts, there she is, the finished scout dress. After you've sewn on your last buttons, just be sure to tack down any of your loose facings, for example at the shoulders and along the inside if you need to. Let it hang on a dress form overnight, best 24 hours at least. Overnight's always best. And then you'll just need to do a narrow hem. The hem may drop a little bit unevenly, so be sure to try it on and level out the hem, remove any excess fabric as needed, retaining a 5/8 seam allowance or hem allowance. There's definitely instructions on that too in the written instructions. But there she is. Enjoy, and if you're working with a fabric like taffeta, also if it's got some wrinkles, use a garment steamer or hit it with a little bit of misting of water and then the garment steamer, and it'll lay so beautifully. So, alright, Charm Scouts, enjoy! Bye-bye!